The wind cuts through your sodden wool like it isn't even there. Your fingers have stopped hurting, which means they've stopped working. Every step drives icy water deeper into your boots, and the sky is already darkening toward a night that will drop well below freezing. You are 8 hours from shelter, and your clothes are soaked. Here's the question that would determine whether you lived or died. How do you dry your clothing when building a fire would get you killed just as surely as the cold? For thousands of years, travelers across the frozen reaches of the world faced this exact dilemma. And here's what might surprise you. Many of them didn't actually need fire at all. They had developed something far more sophisticated, a complete system of moisture management that worked even in the most brutal conditions. Some of these techniques were so effective that modern survival researchers are only now beginning to understand the physics behind why they worked. But before we explore those methods, you need to understand why wet clothing in winter isn't just uncomfortable. It's a death sentence waiting to execute itself. Water conducts heat away from your body approximately 25 times faster than dry, still air. When your clothing becomes saturated, it transforms from insulation into a refrigeration system, working relentlessly against you. Your core temperature begins dropping immediately. In conditions below freezing, this process accelerates dramatically. A person who would survive hours in dry clothing can become dangerously hypothermic in minutes when wet. The danger compounds terribly as night approaches. During movement, your body generates considerable heat through muscle activity, enough to potentially offset some heat loss, even in compromised clothing. But the moment you stop to rest, that heat production plummets. This is precisely when wet clothing becomes most deadly. Exhausted travelers who lay down to sleep in damp garments often never woke up. Medieval chronicles from Northern Europe and Scandinavian territories record entire groups of pilgrims found frozen in their beds, their clothing still wet from the previous day's travel through snow. Your extremities face an even more immediate threat. Wet boots and gloves create perfect conditions for frostbite. The moisture conducts cold directly against skin while simultaneously preventing your body heat from warming the trapped air. Fingers and toes can become damaged beyond recovery within hours. In severe cases, within minutes. There's a reason so many historical accounts mention travelers losing digits to cold. The wet clothing they couldn't dry was often responsible, so fire seems like the obvious solution. Build a blaze, hang your clothes nearby, let radiant heat drive the moisture out. This is exactly what most travelers did when circumstances allowed. But circumstances often didn't allow. Fire announces your presence to anyone within miles. Smoke rises visibly during the day and carries on the wind for vast distances. At night, flames create a beacon visible from hilltops and ridgelines far beyond what most people estimate. The smell of wood smoke is distinctive and travels even farther, even when the fire itself remains hidden behind terrain. For certain travelers in certain times, these signals could prove fatal. Consider the reality of medieval borderlands. Contested regions where bandits, hostile patrols, or raiding parties moved through the same territory. A merchant traveling alone with valuable goods couldn't announce his position. A courier carrying sensitive messages between hostile powers needed invisibility. A hunter from a rival clan moving through disputed forest understood that detection meant death. For these people, a fire might save them from the cold only to deliver them to something worse. This wasn't paranoia. It was calculation made by practical people facing practical dangers, and it demanded alternatives. The first layer of this system wasn't about drying clothes at all. It was about choosing clothing that could function even when wet. Wool became the dominant material for cold weather travel across nearly every culture that had access to sheep. And this wasn't coincidence. Wool possesses a unique combination of properties that make it almost miraculous for moisture management. The fiber structure creates tiny air pockets that retain some insulating capacity even when saturated. More importantly, wool can absorb a significant percentage of its weight in moisture into its fibers while still feeling relatively dry to the touch. The moisture becomes trapped within the fiber itself rather than pooling on the surface against your skin. Archaeological evidence from northern European bog finds has preserved woolen garments thousands of years old, and the density of their weave reveals sophisticated understanding of this principle. These weren't crude blankets wrapped around bodies. They were carefully constructed layers designed for specific purposes within an overall system. Linen behaves completely differently. It absorbs moisture rapidly and loses virtually all insulating value when wet. It also dries quickly when conditions permit, considerably faster than wool. This made linen valuable as an inner layer in some systems, worn directly against skin where it could wick perspiration outward. The wet linen garment could then be replaced with a dry one carried in a protected bundle, while the damp one was stored or hung to dry during travel. Fur and leather added additional options. Fur with the hair side outward shed snow and light rain effectively. The guard hairs channeled moisture away before it could penetrate to the dense underfur where actual insulation occurred. Leather, when properly prepared with oils and fats, could resist moisture penetration for extended periods. But leather that became truly saturated was difficult to dry and could stiffen in cold to the point of being unwearable. Here's where the system becomes genuinely clever. Travelers didn't simply choose better materials and hope for the best. They developed routines for managing moisture through the entire day. The principle of layering that modern outdoor clothing relies upon was understood centuries ago, though not described in those terms. The goal was never to prevent all moisture from entering clothing. That's impossible when traveling through snow, rain, or even just exhaling inside a face covering hour after hour. Instead, the goal was to control where moisture accumulated and ensure it could be removed before nightfall. Smart winter travelers maintained a constant rotation. Outer layers absorbed moisture from the environment. Inner layers stayed dry. The outer layers could be wrung out, beaten vigorously to remove ice crystals, and worn damp during movement when body heat could drive some moisture outward through evaporation. But the inner layer, the one directly against skin, that layer was protected at almost any cost. Many traditions involved carrying a spare inner garment wrapped in oiled cloth or hide in the most protected part of a traveler's pack. This wasn't extra weight to be discarded when loads became heavy. It was survival equipment as essential as food or water. When the worn inner layer became too damp from perspiration, it was exchanged. The damp garment went into the pack for later drying or was hung from the outside of clothing during travel, where movement and wind could begin extracting moisture. This brings us to something that sounds completely wrong but worked remarkably well. Drying by wind and movement without any heat source at all. Cold air is often extremely dry, winter air especially. The physics of phase change mean that even at temperatures below freezing, moisture can sublimate, pass directly from ice crystals to water vapor without becoming liquid first. This process is slow, but it happens continuously whenever conditions permit. Garments exposed to dry, cold wind will gradually lose moisture through this mechanism. Travelers from steppe cultures understood this intimately from childhood. Riders would drape damp items across their horses' hindquarters or tie them to saddles where they would flap continuously in the wind created by passage. Hours of movement through cold, dry air could significantly reduce the moisture content of a garment without any fire at all. The fabric might feel stiff and cold, but it would be meaningfully drier. Scandinavian fishermen and sailors developed similar techniques adapted to their circumstances. Returning from work with thoroughly soaked outer clothing, they would hang garments in locations exposed to steady wind but sheltered from additional precipitation. In some conditions, clothes would freeze completely solid first, becoming boards of ice-stiffened fabric. Then they would gradually sublimate over time. A frozen shirt in dry wind could become wearable again by the following day. But the most counterintuitive method was body drying, using your own metabolic heat to dry clothing while you slept. This technique was documented across numerous cold weather cultures, from the Arctic to the Alps to the forests of northern Asia. The principle seems like it should kill you. Place damp garments against your body overnight, using your core temperature to drive moisture out. Yet it worked when done correctly. The key was insulation mathematics. If you had sufficient covering heavy furs, dense wool blankets, a properly constructed sleeping arrangement that trapped body heat effectively, your metabolism produced enough warmth to create a stable microclimate even while driving moisture from damp items placed strategically within that space. The garments being dried couldn't be soaked through. Wringing, pressing between dry materials, and initial wind exposure during travel reduced them to merely damp. Only then were they placed inside the sleeping arrangement. Some traditions specified placing them against the torso, the warmest part of the body. Others positioned them along the thighs or wrapped around the midsection. The garments absorbed body heat. The heat drove moisture outward into the larger insulating layer, and by morning the items had dried significantly. This wasn't comfortable. People woke chilled and clammy, but they woke with dry inner clothing, which meant they could survive another day of travel. Felt boots, used across Central Asia and into Russia for centuries, demonstrate another approach entirely. Felt is wool that has been processed into a dense, non-woven material with exceptional insulating properties and surprising moisture management characteristics. When properly made, felt resists moisture penetration from outside, while allowing moisture from within to migrate slowly outward through its structure. Foot wraps, long strips of cloth wound carefully around the feet according to specific techniques, added another layer of moisture control. The system worked like this. Feet perspired during the day, unavoidably. The foot wrap absorbed that moisture, keeping it away from direct, prolonged skin contact. At rest, the foot wrap was unwound, wrung if necessary, and hung to air in whatever breeze was available. A spare wrap was used. The felt outer boot, being dense and somewhat moisture-resistant, dried slowly, but its sheer thickness meant it retained substantial insulating value even when damp. Travelers who understood this complete system could maintain functional footwear indefinitely without fire. Those who didn't could lose their feet to frostbite within days. The difference was knowledge, not equipment. Waxed cloth added another crucial tool to this system. By treating linen or wool with rendered animal fat, beeswax, or various other available substances, travelers created outer layers that shed water almost entirely. These couldn't breathe, they trapped moisture inside as readily as they blocked it from outside, but worn as an outermost shell over other layers, they prevented external moisture from ever reaching the insulating garments beneath. Alpine couriers crossing high passes in terrible conditions relied heavily on such treatments. Their outer cloaks might be stiff with wax and deeply unpleasant against bare skin, but they could travel through driving snow and freezing rain without their wool layers becoming saturated. The waxed layer could be shaken free of accumulated snow and ice at rest stops. The layers beneath remained dry enough to function. Shelter placement mattered enormously for overnight drying without fire. Natural features that blocked wind completely also trapped moisture from breath and body. Those that allowed some air circulation aided drying but reduced warmth. Experienced travelers learned to read the landscape carefully for locations that offered protection from precipitation, while permitting the steady air movement that assisted moisture removal. Snow caves and similar fully enclosed shelters created warmth efficiently but trapped humidity. Items dried slowly, if at all, in that moist environment. Open-sided shelters that blocked wind from the most threatening direction while remaining open to dry air from another allowed faster moisture loss, though at some cost of retained warmth. The calculation wasn't simple. It varied with temperature, with wind conditions, with available materials, with how wet the clothing already was and what the next day's travel would demand. Timing of travel itself became part of the system for peoples who had generations to refine their approach. Cultures in extremely cold regions often traveled during the coldest parts of the day when snow was firm and less likely to melt against clothing from body heat. They rested during relatively warmer periods when careful exposure to sun and breeze could assist drying. This seems backward from our perspective. Shouldn't you travel when conditions are mildest? But the logic was sound. Movement during extreme cold meant less moisture accumulation. Rest during marginal conditions allowed moisture removal without fire. We have evidence of these practices from multiple sources. Archaeological preservation of textile fragments with wear patterns consistent with specific uses and layering strategies. Ethnographic recordings from indigenous peoples of the Arctic, Siberia, and northern Scandinavia made during the 19th and early 20th centuries, before traditional practices had fully disappeared under modernization. Medieval travel accounts and monastic records that mention clothing management routines as casually as modern accounts mention checking weather forecasts. Experimental archaeology projects that have tested historical methods under controlled conditions and found them viable if demanding. None of this was magic. None of it was comfortable. It was accumulated knowledge, passed through generations, refined through fatal mistakes that taught survivors what not to do. And this returns us to where we began. You're standing in failing light with wet clothing and no ability to build a fire. Your fingers have stopped hurting. The night is coming, and the cold is patient. If you were a medieval courier crossing hostile territory, you would already know what to do. You wouldn't panic. You would systematically wring and beat your outer garments until they stopped dripping. You would confirm that your inner layer remained dry or exchange it for the spare you carried protected. You would move steadily until you reached shelter, letting wind and movement extract what moisture they could from outer layers. You would construct your sleeping arrangement carefully, placing strategically damp items within your coverings where body heat could work through the night. You would wake cold and stiff but alive, with clothing dry enough to continue. This was never about a single clever trick. It was a system. Material selection, layering logic, moisture, rotation, timing, shelter choice, and the counterintuitive willingness to use your own body as a drying mechanism. Each element supported the others. Remove one, and the system degraded toward failure. Master all of them, and fire became useful rather than essential. The knowledge that kept those travelers alive wasn't written in survival manuals. It was carried in tradition, in daily practice, in the fabric choices and hourly routines that seemed unremarkable to those who grew up with them. A traveler from such a tradition wouldn't have described what they knew as special or ingenious. They would have called it common sense. To us, looking back from heated buildings and synthetic fabrics designed by engineers, it seems almost impossible. Survival through bitter cold without flame, drying without heat, but they did it, routinely, for centuries upon centuries across every frozen landscape on Earth. The next time you see a depiction of a medieval traveler trudging through snow, wool cloak wrapped tight against the wind, consider what that cloak represented. Not just clothing, a technology, a system refined through generations of brutal necessity. The difference, quite literally, between waking up and not waking at all. The cold was always waiting. They simply learned, through patience and accumulated wisdom, how not to let it win.